Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 29, verses 1 through 30. Many times, names in the Bible hold important meanings. Is there any significance in Leah and Rachel's names?
You know, Leah's name is a little bit challenging for us to determine what it actually means, in part because the version of her name has two potential different roots. The one, if it has kind of a more Akkadian origin, would mean something approximately like a cow. So that's not necessarily the most flattering description for Leah, which seems to fit within the broader contrast between her and her sister in this passage, especially when you consider that Rachel's name, we do know what that means. It means ewe, like a lamb. So it's this kind of this idea of this prized possession, a little lamb, versus potentially Leah being the cow as the older sister. So there is potentially a kind of unfortunately humorous undertone to the contrast of these names. Rachel is the beautiful, attractive sister. Leah's the older sister with weak eyes. Rachel's the ewe lamb, and Leah's the cow. So that's one potential meaning of Leah's name, but it's not certain. The other is, if in a more kind of Hebraic roots, if that's kind of the origin of her name could be related to a word that means restless or impatient. And in that as well, there would be some payoff in the later development of the narrative, where Leah is kind of engaged in a arms race, if you will, with her sister for who can have the most children. And Leah is restless or impatient to win the favor of her husband, who loves his other wife, her sister Rachel, more than he loves Leah. So we do know what Rachel's name means, which is also appropriate considering that Rachel is a shepherdess, that her name means lamb. Leah's name is a little bit more uncertain. It could mean cow, or it could be a reference to restlessness or impatience. Regardless, what is going to be interesting is that names are going to be very important as we move forward, particularly for Rachel and Leah's children. The names that they give to their sons are going to be significant for the rest of the narrative of the book of Genesis.
Why is it important that Laban gave each of his daughters a female servant?
Yeah, so as we're reading through this chapter, almost offhandedly, in fact, in our English text, they're handled as parenthetical statements. There's a reference to the fact that Laban gives to each of his daughters a female maidservant. And at first that seems to be just sort of an offhand piece of housekeeping in the text that doesn't have a whole lot of relevance to us. But it's interesting to kind of to frame a little bit our thinking on this. There are all of these incidents of women at the well throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Genesis. We've seen this already with Abraham's servant meeting Rebekah at a well. Now Jacob meets Rachel at a well. Wells, both in the ancient world as well as in the biblical text, are frequently likened or have some sort of analogous connection to fertility. And so there's this ripe symbolism of a groom meeting his wife or prospective wife at a well. But it's interesting, of course, in this narrative that there is an obstacle to access the well. There's a large stone that's over the mouth of the well that Jacob has to move before the sheep can be watered. And if we think of this well, both in biblical narrative and in the ancient Near East, and in these ongoing instantiations of the wife meeting husband at the well, scenes of these connotations of marital fertility, it's interesting that this well has a stone, and Rachel is going to struggle with barrenness. So there's going to be an obstacle to her fertility that has to be overcome. Well, in this battle between Leah and Rachel for the first place of love from their husband, Jacob, we're going to see that children are going to play a significant factor in this, and that Leah is going to try to win her husband's favor away from Rachel by having more sons for him, and that's going to take advantage of Rachel's barrenness, because Rachel, by her appearance and her husband's favor, has Jacob's heart, but Leah's the one giving him children. And so Rachel will eventually have children, but in the meantime, in order to each try to outdo the other in how many sons that she can provide to Jacob, Rachel and Leah are going to give their maidservants to Jacob as concubines in a way similar to the way that Sarah did with her handmaiden Hagar with Abraham. And so these two maidservants that seem to get just passing reference in chapter 29 are actually going to be very important to the development of the 12 tribes or the 12 sons of Jacob that will develop into the 12 tribes of Israel. So these women are actually going to be important in the biblical narrative as a whole.
How do we reconcile Laban's affirmations of Jacob as his dear kinsman with his deception?
It is seemingly so odd that Laban meets Jacob with these effusive demonstrations of familial tenderness. He recognizes in Jacob that this is indeed my sister Rebekah's son. Likely he hasn't heard from Rebekah for years and years. So this is a contact point for him from really a lost relationship with one of his siblings. And he even makes note of the fact that it would be better to have Jacob as a son-in-law than about any other man that he could imagine because of these close family relations. And of course, it was custom in those times to marry closer family relations. And that was actually seen as a good thing rather than the negative connotations that we would have today or that later develop even in the law of Israel itself. So Laban affirms his love for Jacob as his nephew, affirms that Jacob rightfully is the best kind of match he could see for his daughters, and then so willingly takes advantage of Jacob's trust in him to insert Leah in Rachel's place. And then when Jacob calls him out on it, to basically twist the screws and say, well, if you really want my daughter Rachel, guess what? You're going to have to serve me for another 7 years. And I think what we find is the same kind of duplicitous character that we've seen in Jacob being revisited in Laban, somebody who's willing to take advantage even of his close family. And that's another point of contact between Jacob and Laban's character. Jacob's willing to take advantage of his brother, of his father. Laban very willing to take advantage of his nephew turned son-in-law. There's no qualms in Laban's mind about doing this. And we're going to find out in the next couple of chapters that Laban is a pagan man who worships idols. And we find this out when Rachel, Jacob's wife, steals the household items from the household idols from Laban. So Laban has an ethic that is situated in his idolatry. He has a materialism that is grounded in his love of possessions that we've known about ever since the first time we met Laban, and he sprints to meet Abraham's servant, the man who has come with financial gifts and jewelry. And so we find in Laban's character a reflection of Jacob that's a warning to Jacob. This is the end of where your duplicitous dealings will lead you if you won't humble yourselves and submit to the God who is calling to lead you instead.
In verse 26, when Laban says that it is not done in his country to give the younger before the older, does he know what Jacob did to Esau, and is that actually a custom?
Yeah, we're not given all of that information in the text. I think it's certainly possible that at some time in these 7 years that Jacob has been serving Laban, that of course they have conversations, and perhaps even in a kind of a customary sense of a prospective son-in-law with a father-in-law. Well, how do you intend to provide for my daughter, Jacob? What's your plans for her? And possibly in that context, Jacob says, well, actually, you know that Abraham, my grandfather, was a wealthy man. He passed that all down to my father Isaac. And through various circumstances, I actually am the one who has the birthright and the blessing. So I'm going to be able to provide for your daughter, no problem. Maybe Jacob has boasted to his father-in-law in that way. And so perhaps Laban is aware and has sort of reserved that for a moment like this to be able to put some salt in the wounds and bite back at Jacob a little bit for his duplicitousness that was boasted to Laban. So maybe Laban's been looking for this moment, or maybe Laban is completely ignorant. And in God's providence, Laban, almost in a prophetic judgment kind of way, frames his own justification in a way that appropriately cuts at the heart of Jacob's own deceit, and in a way that, like we pointed out in the sermon, almost like a prophet Nathan before King David, you are the man. Do you see, Jacob, even as you are protesting about the injustice of being deceived, that Laban is almost a mirror image of what you have done in the way that you've lived your life. And the situation you are in is the situation you have gladly put others without that singeing your conscience. So I think it's intended to be a wake-up call to Jacob, whether or not it is a conscious barb from Laban's perspective.
Was it most likely a custom at that time?
I think it was. There's the right of primogeniture in the ancient Near East, meaning basically that the firstborn child had the first rights and the primary privileges associated with inheritance and blessings. I think that Laban also situates it in a particular context. It's not so done in our country, so it's really hard to know whether or not in local practice and custom at that time, whether or not this was a thing, but quite likely it was. But regardless, Laban has already agreed to the terms of the deal. Jacob made clear he was serving for Rachel. He asked by name for Rachel's hand, and Laban says, "Yep, that's fine. I'd rather give her to you than anyone else. Go ahead and serve me for 7 years." So even if Laban is now defaulting back on a legal or social custom in his time and in his place, it in no way obfuscates the fact that Laban has morally and ethically reneged on a vow and a promise in a way that impugns his character and demonstrates that he is endeavoring to cheat Jacob out of the rightful terms of the deal that he's made.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.